If you grew up in America in the 80s, you might remember something like this. Someone asks, "Are you okay?" And you say, "Yeah, I'm fine," automatically before you even check whether it's true. Not as a lie, more like a reflex. A way of keeping the conversation clean. A way of not making your feelings someone else's problem. Or maybe you remember being a kid and realizing, quietly, that emotional questions didn't always lead to emotional answers. That the safest version of you was the version that didn't need much. The version that didn't make a scene. The version that could handle it. And if you're Gen X, or if you were raised by Gen X, you've probably felt this difference in the room. They show up, they provide, they do what needs to be done. But when it comes to feelings, there's often a slight step back. Not cold, not cruel, just guarded. Like the emotional door is there, but it doesn't swing open easily. People call it distance. People call it detachment. People call it avoidant. But that explanation doesn't fully land. Because most Gen X emotional distance isn't a personality quirk, it's a pattern. And patterns come from somewhere. It's easy to interpret emotional distance as a lack of love. If someone doesn't talk about their feelings, you assume they don't have them. If someone doesn't ask emotional questions, you assume they don't care. If someone doesn't process, you assume they're emotionally unaware. But for a lot of Gen X, that's not what's happening. What's happening is more subtle. They learned early that feelings weren't always useful to share. They learned that being emotional didn't always get you comfort. Sometimes it got you teased, dismissed, corrected, or ignored. They learned that the fastest way to keep life moving was to keep your inner world contained. So emotional distance became a form of regulation, not because they wanted to be distant, because distance was functional. It kept things from escalating. It kept you from being embarrassed. It kept you from needing something nobody knew how to give. When a nervous system learns that vulnerability doesn't pay off, it stops offering it freely. That's not a moral failure. That's adaptation. So, if we want to understand Gen X emotional distance, we have to stop treating it like a flaw and start treating it like a survival skill learned in a particular environment. Gen X grew up in a very specific cultural weather. Not everyone had the same childhood, but certain patterns were common enough to leave a generational imprint. More kids spending time unsupervised after school. More family stress from divorce, remarriage, financial strain, and shifting norms. A strong cultural respect for toughness and self-reliance. Less mainstream language for emotional needs, therapy, or processing. More emphasis on don't complain and figure it out. This is the backdrop where distance makes sense. Because children don't choose their coping style like a personality test. They absorb it from what works. If being independent gets you praised, you become independent. If being low maintenance keeps the peace, you become low maintenance. If being emotional makes things worse, you become contained. Gen X didn't just grow up with technology that was different. They grew up with emotional expectations that were different. They learned early that life moves on whether you're ready or not. And once you learn that, you start moving on too sometimes before you've actually felt what happened. A lot of Gen X kids learned solitude before they learned emotional support. Keys on a string, notes on the counter, be home by 6. Don't open the door. Call if there's an emergency. After-school routines built around independence, not constant adult presence. And here's what that teaches a nervous system. I am responsible for managing myself, not just practically emotionally. If you're alone and you're scared, you learn to quiet yourself. If you're alone and you're bored, you learn to fill the space. If you're alone and you're sad, you learn to swallow it until it passes. Over time, this builds competence. Gen X often became extremely capable, good at problem solving, good at staying calm, good at handling real-world tasks earlier than many people today. But competence has a shadow. When you learn to handle everything internally, you also learn to minimize your needs. You don't practice asking. You don't practice receiving. You don't practice being messy in front of someone who will stay steady. So later, when someone wants emotional openness, it can feel foreign not because they don't love you, but because their nervous system doesn't associate openness with relief. It associates openness with risk. Latchkey life didn't ruin Gen X. It trained them, and what was trained shows up decades later as emotional distance that looks like calm. There was a kind of cultural messaging that ran under a lot of 80s childhoods. Don't be dramatic. Don't be sensitive. Don't make it a big deal. Walk it off. Quit crying. Suck it up. Sometimes it was said harshly. Sometimes it was said casually. Sometimes it was said with love, but without emotional skill. Either way, the lesson lands the same. Needing comfort is embarrassing. Needing reassurance is weakness. Needing attention is too much. And the quickest way to avoid shame is to reduce your needs. So a lot of Gen X learn to become emotionally efficient. They learn to handle pain quietly. They learn to convert vulnerability into humor. They learn to convert fear into sarcasm. They learn to keep their inner world private, not as secrecy, but as control. This is why Gen X distance often comes with a certain tone. Steady, dry, self-contained, sometimes funny, sometimes blunt. That tone isn't random. It's protection. If you're Gen X, what phrase did you hear that trained this toughness? Walk it off. Quit crying. Don't be dramatic. Deal with it. Or something else. Drop the exact phrase in the comments. One sentence can explain an entire coping style. Because once you name the phrase, you can see the pattern. It wasn't emotional emptiness. It was emotional conditioning. A lot of Gen X grew up alongside major shifts in family structure. Again, not everyone, but enough people that it shaped the emotional atmosphere of the era. Divorce, remarriage, blended families, co-parenting before it had clean language, adults under stress, trying to keep life functioning. And when adults are overwhelmed, children often do something that looks like maturity, but is actually strategy. They become easier. They become the kid who doesn't complain, the kid who doesn't cause problems, the kid who tries not to add weight to a house that already feels heavy. This is where emotional distance becomes a kind of kindness, at least from the child's perspective. If my parent is stressed, I won't bring my feelings. If the house is tense, I won't be the spark. If everyone is tired, I won't ask for more. The child learns to regulate the room by regulating themselves. And when you practice that for years, it becomes identity. I'm the strong one. I'm the easy one. I'm the one who can handle it. Later, people see that competence and assume ease. But the nervous system remembers the real reason it formed, because the environment didn't always have space for your feelings. That's why Gen X distance can look like strength and feel like fatigue. They didn't avoid emotions because they didn't have them. They avoided emotions because they learned to protect other people from them. Gen X didn't just grow up with fewer emotional conversations. They grew up with a powerful teacher of social behavior, media, sitcom timing, movie one-liners, the rise of cool as a social identity, humor as defense, sarcasm as intelligence, detachment as confidence. Pop culture often rewarded a particular vibe. Don't try too hard. Don't look desperate. Don't be earnest. Don't be uncool. And earnestness is basically emotional exposure. So if you grew up in a climate that already shamed vulnerability, and then you absorbed media that celebrated being unbothered, you got a double lesson. Feelings are risky, and showing feelings is embarrassing. So Gen X got good at the mask. Not a fake mask, an adaptive mask. The mask that says, I'm fine. The mask that says, whatever. The mask that says, it's not that deep, even when it is. This is part of why Gen X emotional distance can feel so confusing to people raised later. Gen X may show love through loyalty, through reliability, through showing up, through action. But when asked to narrate feelings in a soft, open way, their nervous system may tense up not because they're unwilling, but because the request feels like stepping into a language they weren't trained to speak. They were trained to be cool, not transparent. And cool often comes at the price of emotional accessibility. In many Gen X households, siblings carried more emotional weight than we talk about. Older siblings who became stabilizers, younger siblings who learned loyalty and silence, kids who comforted each other because the adults were busy, stressed, or emotionally unavailable. When siblings become your primary emotional mirror, you learn closeness, but you also learn containment. Because siblings can be supportive, but they can't always hold your emotions safely. They're kids too. They tease, they judge, they compete. End quote. They don't always know what to do with vulnerability. So you learn a very specific kind of closeness. We're together, but we don't talk about everything. We survive. We move on. That bond is powerful. It creates resilience. It creates loyalty. It creates a lifelong us against the world feeling in some families. But it can also teach a nervous system that emotional truth is private, not because it's shameful, but because it's too heavy to risk. So Gen X grew up fast in many ways. Not always in dramatic ways, often in small ways. You learned what moods meant by reading footsteps. You learned what not to say by watching reactions. You learned what to carry by carrying it, and the more you carry young, the more distance looks like stability later. Here's the twist that changes how you see Gen X. For many of them, emotional distance wasn't a rejection of connection. It was a version of connection that felt safe. It was love without mess, love without burden, love without asking for what might not be available. A lot of Gen X learned to show care by not complicating things. They show up. They handle the problem. They fix the thing. They make sure you're okay materially. They stay loyal in ways that don't require emotional performance. And if you ask them, many will tell you, sometimes indirectly, that they didn't want to be a problem. That line alone explains so much. Because when your childhood teaches you that being a problem risks shame, you build a personality around being manageable. You become the person who doesn't need much, the person who won't fall apart, the person who keeps it together. And then people call you emotionally distant. But from the inside, it often feels like being considerate. This doesn't mean the pattern is perfect. It can create loneliness. It can create misunderstandings. It can make intimacy feel difficult. But it deserves accuracy. Most Gen X distance isn't I don't care. It's I learn to care without asking for space. And that's a heartbreaking kind of love because it costs the person who's doing it. So the roots of Gen X emotional distance aren't mysterious. They're environmental. A childhood with more independence and less supervision for many. A culture that prized toughness and mocked sensitivity. Family stress that trained kids to be easier. Media that celebrated cool, sarcasm, and detachment. Sibling bonds that created survival closeness rather than emotional storytelling. Put that together, and you get a nervous system that's highly functional and often deeply loyal, yet cautious with vulnerability. Gen X isn't emotionless. They're regulated through containment. They learn to keep feelings inside long enough to function. They learn to avoid emotional chaos because chaos felt like danger. They learned to survive without asking for much, and sometimes they kept living that way, even when life became safer. That's the imprint. Not superior, not inferior, just shaped by timing. If you're Gen X and you've been called closed off, it makes sense that it stings. Because most of you weren't trying to be cold. You were trying to be stable. If you feel uncomfortable when someone wants a long emotional conversation, it makes sense. If you show love through action more than words, it makes sense. If you struggle to ask for help even when you need it, it makes sense. If you feel guilty for having needs, it makes sense. You weren't born that way. You were trained. And if you love a Gen X person, understanding this can shift everything. What looks like distance is often self-control. What looks like avoidance is often fear of burdening you. What looks like indifference is often a nervous system that doesn't know how to be safely messy. The goal isn't to blame the past. It's to recognize the pattern so you can stop misreading each other. Because misreading creates more distance than distance ever did. If you're Gen X, tell me, what did emotional strength mean in your house? Was it silence, humor, handling things alone, not crying, not needing help? And if you're not Gen X, but you were raised by it, what did love look like in your home? Acts of service, reliability, problem solving, showing up without talking much? Share one detail in the comments. Your answer might help someone else finally understand the people they grew up with. And if you want more videos about the quiet psychology behind American generations, how environments shape nervous systems, relationships, and identity, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching.